Sotah Daf continues working through our Mishnah, our last Mishnah, which describes the procedure that the Sotah goes through in the Lishkas Hagazis in the Azara with the Sanhedrin. Towards the end of the Daf, we get to the next Mishnah, which talks about how the Sotah procedure is Mida Keneged Mida. It's befitting for what she's suspected of. So let's begin. The Gemara comments on the fact that the Mishnah says that they would bring her up to the Shari Mizrach, to the eastern gate to Shar Nicanor and the Azar. So the Gemara asks, that's where she was already. I've said before that she comes to the Sanhedrin. That's where the Sanhedrin are seated. So what do you mean you bring her? She's already there. So the Gemara says, no, because in the meantime, she had left. She had gone for a walk, and they make her walk around and around all over the place in order to tie her out, to try to wear down her resistance so that she'd be more likely to admit that she's guilty instead of trying to drink the water and suffering what comes from it. The Gemara says you have a brisa that says a similar thing happens to a pair of Adim that come to testify about a capital punishment case. Shimon ben Elazar says they make them walk around from place to place in order to wear them down so that if they're lying, they'll admit. Next, the Mishnah said that the place is the spot in the eastern gate, Shar HaNicanor. That is, three things happen there. The Sotah drinks her water. The Mitzorah has his Tahara procedure, including the blood on his toe and his ear and his thumb. That happens there. And the Yoledes, a woman who gave birth, brings her karbanos. She stands there also. So the Gemara explains all three. So the Sotah comes from the pasuk which says, "V'hem rakonas isha lifnei Hashem." It has to be before Hashem. That's as close as she can get to the Kodesh, to the Azara. The Mitzorah also can't get much closer because he is tummy as well, and there it specifically says V'hem rakoin hamitaher. Again, it says the entrance to the Ohel HaMoed, so that's the gate of the Azara. So it says that those two specifically. However, what is the Yoledes doing there? Why does she have to stand there at that gate? It doesn't say Lifnei Hashem about a Yoledes. So the Gemara assumes the reason is because she has to stand as close to her karbanos. She brings two karbanos. She has to stand as close to them as possible. We have a brisa that says a person has to stand over watching his carbon, but so that's as close as she can get, so that's where she stands. The question then is, why only a Yoledes is mentioned? You should mention a Zav and a Zava. They also have to bring karbanos, and they also should stand there. Someone says, you're right. The Tana meant to include them as well. I just mentioned one, but Yoledes, Zav, Zava, they're all in the same category, and that's the reason that they are there. Okay, now we bring a brisa which discusses, can you have two sotas undergoing the procedure together? So the brisa says you can't. And the question is why? And we're going to discuss three possible reasons why. So the first opinion that we have is the Tanakama, and he says that the reason is because they will encourage each other and they will prop each other up. So if one is very confident, then she may prop up the other one. As a matter of fact, the one who's confident might be confident because she's innocent, but the one who will be propped up is guilty. And she will end up insisting she wants to drink the water because she's propped up by the other one and given false confidence. We don't want them to have that effect on each other, and therefore we don't do two sotas together. Now Rabbi Yehuda has a different approach. He says you can't give that reason. It's Xeris HaKosav. The Torah says Osa. It says V'hishbia Osa HaKoin, her singular. That means it can only be one there at a time. Now the Tanakama, even though that pasuk is true, and he agrees with that pasuk, and he has that source, so Mark explains this Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon says you're allowed to, and you're supposed to give reasons for what the pasuk says. That's Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Other Tanaim argue you don't go with reasons, you just go with what it says without trying to figure out the reason. So Mar asks, what's the difference between these two before we bring in the third opinion? The Mar says, what's the difference between them? The Mar says the difference would be if one of them is very quavery and shaky, so she's obviously not going to prop anybody else up, then maybe you wouldn't have an issue. If, however, there's a Kosav, then it doesn't matter if your reason is not going to apply. The Xeris HaKosav says that you can't do it. So Mar said there's a third problem, and that is you can't do mitzvos in lumps. You can't pile mitzvos together. It's called mitzvos chavilos. You don't want to do mitzvos in heaps. And the reason is because that shows that you don't want to do it. You want to try to get rid of it, get it over with. So on a list, there's a mission that lists things you can't do together in heaps. You can't do two sotos together. You can't do two mitzoraim together. You can't do the hole in the ear for two avadim together. And you can't do two egla rufos together because it's all chavilos. So even if you have a situation where they're quavery and they're shaky and they're not going to cause encouragement to each other, you still can't do them together because of chavilos. So Gemara answers That's not a kasha. Chavilas is only if it's one kohen doing both of them. If you have two separate kahanim, each one doing one sotah, it wouldn't be chavilos. But you would have a problem of the gzeres akasav, and if they are supporting each other. If they're not supporting each other because they're both scared, then that wouldn't be an issue. The Gemara now goes on to the next line in the Mishnah where it says that the kohen would tear her garment and that would expose the upper part of her chest. So the Gemara says, how do you know that? So the pasuk says, "Upara es rosh ha'isha," that you expose the head of the woman. The fact that it says the woman ha'isha instead of just rosha, that teaches you have to expose part of the body as well, not just the head. If so, why does it say the head? To teach that she has to let her hair down. Okay, next the Gemara gets into the Machakas of Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda said that if she's beautiful, then she was not exposed, and the Chachamim did not differentiate. It sounds like they're arguing over was there any type of woman that should not be exposed, and Rabbi Yehuda seems to be more concerned for Hirum, more concerned that the men that are around would have improper thoughts if they were to see her. So Gemara asks, so Rabbi Yehuda is the one who's concerned about that, and the Rabbanan are not concerned, but we have a different brisa talking about a woman who is sent out to Skila, where they have the opposite position. The Rabbanan are the ones who are concerned, Rabbi Yehuda is not concerned. So that's a contradiction in both of them. So the Gemara quotes that brisa. The brisa says that when a person was given Skila, so he was thrown off the heights, he was undressed so that he would die quicker and not suffer. However, they did cover their private parts so to reduce the shame. So what did they cover? So for a man, they covered just the front with a small cloth. But what was covered for a woman? So Rabbi Yehuda says it was the front and the back of the body, again in the small area, the Arab area. The Rabbanan say she was fully dressed. That means that the Rabbanan seem to be concerned for Hirhurim, for improper thoughts of the people around, but Rabbi Yehuda is not. It's the opposite of what we see here. So the Gemara answers it's not a contradiction. The Gemara says if you look at the scenario, it's very different. The Gemara first addresses Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says that in the case of the Sotah, she may come out of this alive. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda is very concerned for her Hurim here, because if she's alive, the Kahanim, or whoever's around and sees her, will then chase after her. In the case of the woman who's on her way to Skila, there's going to be nothing to lust after. She's going to soon be dead. And if you're afraid that it's going to cause them to have improper attractions to other women because of what they saw, so we quote Rava, who says, Yetzer Hara only pushes a person towards what he sees, not towards something else. So Gemara says, okay, why are you only answering for Yehuda? What about Rabbanan? To steer in the Rabbanan also. The Gemara answers that the difference is because the Rabbanan understand that the reason for all this is so that other women should see what happened to her and make sure not to put themselves in a situation of suspicion. So in the case of the Sotah, we have to make her degraded to be to scare off other women and make sure they don't do something like that. So the whole point of making her suffer through this indignity is to scare people off. In the case of the woman who's getting skila, everyone's scared off anyway. There's no reason to put her through that indignity, and therefore she is given skila clothed. There's no reason for that indignity. So the Gemara says maybe I should make her suffer two things, both the skila and the indignity. So Gemara says no. We have a pasuk that we have to the recha kamoicha, should love your fellows yourself. Even somebody who's getting skila, you should make it as pleasant and as painless as possible. It should be a misa yafa, a good death. And therefore we don't want to make her suffer shame and embarrassment if there's no reason to. And that's halacha that's brought by Rav Nachman. And therefore she can be fully clothed. So now the Gemara says, okay, hold on a second. So what then is the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, whether she's dressed or only minimally covered? Is it perhaps, they argue, as to whether or not she should get a good death? Do they argue over this concept of Rav Nachman, this we have to let recha kamoicha, and Rabbi Yehuda would say let her die faster and be minimally dressed, and the Chachamim would say okay, it doesn't matter if she's clothed. They would not hold of this Rav Nachman. So Gemara says no, that's not what they're arguing about. They both agree we want to give her the best experience we possibly can given the circumstance. The question is, what would a person prefer? According to Rabbi Yehuda, a person would prefer to die faster and not be covered. They prefer the pain. They prefer to not have the pain rather than to not have the shame. According to the Chachamim, they prefer to not have the shame, and they're willing to deal with pain a little bit longer. Moving on, the next line in the Mishnah said that if she was dressed in white clothing, that's removed and she's given black clothing. The Gemara quotes a brisa that says if she happened to look very good in black clothing, then they didn't give her those. Instead, they just gave her ugly, dirty clothing. Next, it says if she had jewelry and gold, it was removed. The Gemara says that should be obvious. If she's made to suffer the indignity of not proper dress, certainly she can't wear jewelry. Someone says, no, you may think that the jewelry is actually makes her look ridiculous because she's exposed and she's wearing jewelry. It's kind of like if you see a messenger, the Gemara quotes, that people say if you have a messenger who's running and he's wearing only shoes, people are going to laugh at him and say, what's this guy not wearing anything, but he's wearing his shoes. So if she's wearing jewelry, but she's exposed on top, that would look even more ridiculous. Kamashma, no, don't wear the jewelry. Okay, next it says that they brought in a special thick Egyptian rope and they tied it around above her chest so that it should hold her clothing up so it shouldn't fall too far. So the Gemara asks, why did they need the special mitzvah rope? Is that specifically they needed that and they couldn't use something else? Or was it okay to have anything else? Now, if the reason is just so that it shouldn't fall, so you should be able to use some other thing. If, however, the problem is that she probably girded herself with a fancy garment of some sort around the waist. She used like a belt or something that was fancy in order to seduce the man who she was together with. Then we would specifically want to use a rough, thick Egyptian belt, Egyptian rope, to teach her a lesson. So maybe it's specifically to use that. So the Gemara answers, if you look at the Mishnah carefully, it's pretty clear. The Mishnah says that they use an Egyptian rope in order that her clothing shouldn't fall. So the only reasons that her clothing shouldn't fall, anything which will accomplish that purpose is fine. There's no specific lesson in the Egyptian rope. Okay, next the Gemara asks is a contradiction. At first it says that anybody's allowed to see her, and then it says that women should see her. So which is it? So the Gemara has two answers to this. Abaye says when it says anyone, it means any woman. It doesn't mean anyone. Men aren't allowed to see her. They should not be there. Rava doesn't like that because it does say anyone, and therefore he does not accept interpreting that to mean any woman. Rava says anyone's allowed to see her. It's not usher, but women should specifically go and look. They have a pasuk in Yecheskel that says the nivasru kol hanoshim v'loisa asena kizimaschena. Specifically, want other women to learn a lesson from this whole episode. We now get to the next Mishnah. This Mishnah discusses the actual punishment of the Sotah and says that it is befitting for the actions that she did if she was guilty. So first talking about the suffix Sotah procedure. So it says, in a way that a person is measured, that's how we measure him, meaning it's Mida Keneged Mida. She adorned herself for the purpose of an Avera, so the Torah says that she should be disgraced. She revealed herself in Avera, so the Torah says that she should be exposed. She began with her pleasurable activity from the thigh, which is the first contact, and therefore her punishment begins from the thigh, like when she drinks the water, her thigh first distends and the problem begins there, and then it goes to the stomach, which continues. That's the next area that receives the zera, and then the rest of the body is not saved, it follows along. Now begin the Gemara, which expounds on the topic of Mida Keneged Mida, and also describes more of the Mida Keneged Mida of the Sotah, but that's at the end of it's part of a lengthy brisa, which we won't finish on this daf. It goes deep into the next daf. It's one of quotes of Yosef, who says that even though the 4 misos of the Beis Din today aren't around anymore, something very similar occurs. The Mida Keneged Mida is still there. You may not be able to get the mitzvah from the Beis Din itself, but that similar action will happen. The Gemara quotes the brisa that spells that out. It says that somebody who was obligated skila, which is falling from a high place or being stoned, so he will fall for he will min hashamayim. They will cause him, even though the Sanhedrin can't give it to him, the shamayim will cause him to fall from a roof, or be attacked by a lion, or other animal, which will throw him to the ground and cause the same types of injuries as the stoning. Somebody who is obligated the burning penalty, either he falls into a fire, or he'll get bitten by a poisonous snake, which causes a flaming sensation. Somebody who has obligated to get hariga, that is, to be killed by the sword, either he'll be given over to the king, which kills people by chopping their heads off, or he'll be taken by robbers who do something similar. And somebody who was supposed to get strangulation, either he'll drown in the sea, which is a similar lack of oxygen, or he'll get a disease called Srunachi, also known as askara, which also causes strangulation. Now, the Gemara begins another lengthy brisa, which discusses how the sotah gets mida, and we'll leave that for the next daf.